I'd like to welcome everybody back this afternoon for the final two topics of the Mental Health Task Force. We'll begin in taking a look at the issue on trying to develop a state policy and needs to address our adolescents with high behavioral needs. And we're going to turn some history and explanation of that topic over to Director Schmidt and have follow-up conversation on that from Laurel and Stefan, as their two agencies also participate in responding to the financial needs of those kids when they're put into services. So Director Schmidt, if you'd go ahead and start, we'd appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, I think we're going to put up a PowerPoint presentation and walk through that. It's also in your packet. Oh no, come sit right here. It's obviously raining today in Cheyenne, just so we know. So thank you. A little bit of context for this particular slideshow is that this is an overview of how the Department of Family Services engages in adolescent behavioral health. So we're starting kind of with a wide lens per the perspective of DFS, and as the conversation goes, we'll start to narrow in more into the population. That's the conversation today, the high needs. But I think it's important to have the context of how we serve adolescents with behavioral health needs, because our system is a very specific system, and the number of children that have high needs is much larger than just the Department of Family Services. So on the agenda on the next page, I'm going to walk through who we serve, what services we have available, how the services are funded, and who pays for what. And through that, you'll start to see that there are some holes in the system. And then the biggest question is, so what? What do we do with those holes? So the WHO, the Department of Family Services serves adolescents, minors, typically up to age 18, but we can serve children up to 21 with different types of court orders and providers. This is not a monolithic population, so no one child has the same needs as the next child. The severity of the diagnosis of an adolescent with a behavioral health issue can be very different. They could be educational, behavioral, or clinical. There's sometimes dual diagnosis and dual or more diagnosis. We can have youth that have developmental disabilities in addition to behavioral needs, and also then mental health needs. And then the age is another big factor. And there's the physical age, but then when we're dealing with youth with developmental disabilities, we also have some other just cognitive issues around age. So as we turn to the next page, the WHO, and this part is really important, the custody varies. So the Department of Family Services is an agency that really responds to judicial action or legal action. With the children that we're serving, sometimes the children can live at home with the parent or caregiver. But if DFS has custody, what that means is that there's been a court action that has placed that child into our custody. And there are 3 ways where that child can get placed into our custody. The first one is abuse and neglect. The child is at risk or has been abused or neglected by a parent, and the court has made that determination, and the child has been removed from that home. A child in need of supervision is really about the youth. Incorrigible is one of the words, the old words that they would use for a child in need of supervision. But these are children who have had some level of need, habitually truant, disobedient, ungovernable, and beyond control. But yet the parents haven't abused or neglected the child, and yet that child has not committed a crime. So a lot of the behavioral health needs that we see come to us oftentimes through this door, through a child in need of supervision door. And then juvenile delinquents. this gets a little bit messy because we use the term juvenile delinquent a little bit broader in normal context. For the purposes of DFS and the purposes of the law, this is a specific population, juvenile delinquents who have found to be delinquent by the juvenile court under Title 14. So there has to have been some sort of crime committed, and the juvenile court, not municipal court, not circuit court, the juvenile court has decided that this child is a juvenile delinquent. Youth can travel through any of these phases. They can come to us as abused and neglected case, maybe a little bit older, they commit a crime while they're in care, and then the court switches their petition to a juvenile delinquent. Same thing with child in need of supervision. Usually we don't have juvenile delinquents that switch into abuse and neglect, but I'm sure that that's a possibility. So looking ahead to the next slide, the placement can vary. So when the department has custody, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're with the department. They're not living in our offices, thank goodness. They can be placed at home. They can be in family foster care, which is either with relatives, with kinship, or with strangers, or they can be in a facility or an institutional-based care. Again, children can go from one to another of these placements as well. However, the difference with this in terms of DFS is that there's a court action and a court order that's saying that the department has custody for placement in one of these areas. The child is not there is some sort of court jurisdiction with the family. So moving on, we have the services. So the services are very important through a DFS lens. There are 3 settings that we can provide services in. Outpatient, which is where the child either goes to a therapist, goes to get the care, or the therapy comes to him or her at home or at school. Residential treatment is where the child is living on campus and getting treatment there, and most of the time educational services as well. So a child is ordered to residential treatment. That treatment facility will provide 24-hour care. They will provide educational services, and then they'll either provide the therapy through their own staff, or someone from the community will come and provide therapy to that child at the residential facility. And then inpatient is really a hospital level of care. It's the most restrictive clinical setting, and it requires some sort of medical order. So this is where a physician or some sort of provider would determine that there's a medical necessity for this level of care. And that's important because that's very different than the court making a decision about the level of care. In an inpatient, in what we call a psychiatric residential treatment facility, that has to be a medical determination. So there are 4 different types of services that we're looking at as we're exploring options for outpatient, residential, inpatient, and the milieu of the services that are provided at any one of those levels. So first there's educational, and we have educational placements or services that are provided oftentimes by residential treatment centers, but they can also be provided by boards of cooperative education. BOCES is what we call them. Behavioral, so a child may be placed because of behavioral issues, a lot of acting out, a lot of escalation behaviors, maybe violence, but that there needs to be some sort of intervention in regard to behavioral issues. Clinical, this is really where you start to see those diagnosable mental health diagnoses where there needs to be some sort of therapeutic intervention by a licensed clinician or professional. And then correctional, which is really around the criminal behaviors of the child, that there was something that happened, a delinquent behavior that resulted in some sort of criminal charge, and then the placement or the service that's necessary is to address that delinquency. However, and this is a big part of the high needs, sometimes correctional settings are used in lieu of a therapeutic setting because the therapeutic setting is not available.
I don't mean to interrupt, but an example of that would be is maybe you have a behavioral kid has not committed a crime, nobody will take him, and you end up taking care of him in the boys' school because nobody else will take care of him.
Mr. Chairman, that's somewhat correct. There still has to be a juvenile delinquency charge. So it may be that there's a lot of behaviors going on, and maybe there's the part of the behavior lashes out, hits a staff person, then the child could be charged with some sort of assault. Then they can go into the boys' school or the girls' school. The other thing that is important too is that sometimes when a youth violates a court order, that then can turn into a juvenile delinquency petition, because the law that's been broken is the order was violated. The punishment then, or the reprimand, is then a delinquency, and then boys' school, girls' school, and we do see that. So moving on into the next category. So this, if you have this in front of you, I think it's really hard to see, but it's really important that we think about the services that are down the left-hand column. And these services are all going to reflect back into the description that I just mentioned. So what type of setting, what kind of placement type, and description and admission criteria. So for reference, you can flip back a couple of pages and see where these services fit. So starting at the top, mental health and substance abuse services, we consider to be outpatient. They can be behavioral and clinical. And the description really is those services that are provided in a community. The providers in this group can be a wide array of providers. It can be through local community mental health and substance abuse centers. It could be private care. It could be physicians. It can be private pay. Sometimes some of our youth services offer outpatient services as well. So this really is kind of home-based, community-based treatment. Crisis stabilization is more of a residential setting, but it's a voluntary residential setting. So at this point, there's no court order to access the service. What the service allows is that if there's an adolescent who's experiencing some escalated behaviors, maybe there's something happening at the home, this is a place that a child can go for a stay of up to 30 days. And that provider will work with the family and the child to get the child back home, but it doesn't require a court order. So this is a voluntary service, not unlike the crisis stabilization services that were somewhat discussed earlier with the adult mental health system. We have the Board of Cooperative Educational Services, BOCES, and they serve a couple different roles. The Department of Family Services uses them as a provider for youth who have educational needs, but the school system can also access that provider. So they don't need to have a court order in order for a youth to go to a BOCES. What they have to have is the correct admission criteria based on whatever it is that BOCES requires. But a local district can place a child in a BOCES without DFS, without court. Group homes are also provided throughout the state by community-based organizations. Oftentimes, the group home providers are the same providers as the crisis stabilization services, and this is a residential form of care. In the Department of Family Services system, group homes are typically a court-ordered placement. So what that means then is custody is in the department, and then through recommendations of the department and its providers, the judge then may order that a child be placed in a group home. It's a low level of facility-based care. Education is provided locally. The child goes to the local school district for educational services. Any type of mental health or substance abuse treatment is provided on an outpatient basis. And essentially what the department pays for here is room and board, somewhere for the child to sleep, somewhere for the child to be fed, although the services that they provide are more extensive than that. But when we start to get into this conversation a little bit deeper, you'll see that the Department of Family Services typically pays for room and board. The Department of Health typically pays for medical care, and the Department of Education typically pays for education. So you can tell we're moving up the list a little bit in terms of levels of need or severity. The next is the Residential Treatment Center. And as I previously described, this is a facility-based placement where a child will receive 24 hours of care, 7 days a week, including their educational care. So this is it's a campus typically, serving an array of kids, most of the time boys and girls at various ages. Then we go up to the next level, which is acute psychiatric stabilization. And that's the same as it is in the adult world. It's a stabilization. There's a psychotic break. A child is having severe mental health issues. They go to a facility that provides that service. It is a short-term stay. In our state, we use Wyoming Behavioral Institute as our psychiatric stabilization provider. Then we go to an even higher level of care, which is psychiatric residential treatment. And this is a longer level of care than the stabilization. Mr. Chairman.
Will WBI take your mails?
Mr. Chairman, for the psychiatric stabilization, I do think they take mails, but they do not for the psychiatric residential treatment facility. So psychiatric residential treatment facility for us is really the highest level of clinical care that we can provide a child or adolescent. It is psychiatric care. It requires a physician's order, a determination that that child medically needs that level of care. In Wyoming, we have 2 who provide the service, St. Joseph's in Torrington, and then as mentioned, Wyoming Behavioral Institute in Casper, but they limit their program to females only. This is where we see a lot of our children getting placed out of state, children needing this level of care. What's also a little bit different about this particular level is, again, just like BOCES, where schools could place with a BOCES, children can also be privately placed at a psychiatric residential treatment facility, and children may be on Medicaid and be placed at a psychiatric residential treatment facility without DFS involvement. They do not have to be court-ordered to this level. This is a medical necessity level of care. And then we have the Wyoming Boys School and the Wyoming Girls School. As I mentioned before, this is for delinquent children who have been adjudicated delinquent. The Boys School is located in Worland. The Girls School is located in Sheridan. And that is more correctional than therapeutic, although therapeutic services are provided. They're provided in Worland through the local community mental health center. And in Sheridan, there's a therapist on staff. Both work with local community mental health services in the child's home community for treatment coordination and sometimes actual treatment through telehealth. And the most restrictive level of care is a juvenile detention center, which is just that, it's a detention center. There's a juvenile detention center in Natrona County that works with other counties to take those children, but this is where kids who are under 18 go if they've committed a crime. They are sentenced here as well by a judge or placed pre-adjudication in a juvenile detention center. Some educational services are provided, some mental health services are provided, but they are not there to receive education or mental health services. Moving on, how are the services funded? So it's through this conversation you're really going to see the intersection with all of the agencies, the partnerships that we've developed in order to try to comprehensively serve a child in DFS custody. So the first are community-based services, as I mentioned, outpatient mental health and substance abuse services. If a child is not in our custody, then we have to rely on the parents and the public payment system to provide those services. This is where the community mental health centers play a very important role. Within their contracts with the Department of Health, we access those services through that, typically that funding stream and those services that they already provide to communities. Crisis stabilization centers or services are paid for by a DFS. So the Department of Family Services has a mix of federal funds and state general funds to pay for crisis stabilization services. However, this is a community-based service, so oftentimes municipalities, counties will also support those services. And we encourage that. This isn't a state level of care. This is very local, voluntary, and it's really in the best interest of the community to support this service. However, when a child does then come into custody, and if a child is placed at a residential treatment facility, a group home, day treatment, or juvenile detention, then this law kicks in, 21-13-315, called court-ordered placements. We call it COPS. You'll hear us refer to it as COPS. And what this is a statutory agreement that says all three entities are responsible for the care of this child. DFS will pay for room and board. Department of Education will pay for education. And then health will pay either through Medicaid or through some other means to provide the medical care, including treatment of that youth or child. So another way of saying it comes on the next page. Who pays for what? Here we go. Oh my, sorry, I'm a little out of order. Who pays for what is then listed across the top and then down. This is one way that we're showing who pays for what. It gets very confusing. So this is a good reference chart if you ever wonder, because we get this all the time in committee hearings, who pays for that? Here's a nice chart that shows that. The following slide really though starts to give you a very different visual of how we pay for this. So where you see the blacked out services, that means that the, let me back up a little bit. What this will tell you is who pays for what, depending on what door they come in, okay? So when a court-ordered placement occurs, that's a DFS placement, here's who will pay for what. Okay, so this is a child in the custody of the department. And I don't think I need to go through it, do I? You all can see it. So this tells you the responsibility. This in large part reflects court-ordered placements, but the court-ordered placement statutes. So if we go to the next one then, medically necessary Medicaid placements. So this is fully in the world of the Department of Health. And these are youth that may be on a waiver, or they may be Medicaid eligible to begin with. And these are the services then that Medicaid can pay for. And this is important because the way that we work our system with custody, acute psychiatric stabilization and PRTFs are an important component of that care. Then we go into the last one, which is private placements. Here's what is available for somebody in the community who has a child or is looking for services for their child. And as you can see, there is not a lot that any of the agencies do for these children. A lot of what the agencies pay for are for children that are somewhat eligible, either under a court order or because they're Medicaid eligible. So services are somewhat limited for people who are not in the system. And that's an important distinction because sometimes kids come into our system because they have no other way to access treatment. So then we are narrowed down into holes in the system. So where is it that there are gaps? Complex cases, which is what we're here to talk about today. These are high-need youth for there's no appropriate placement regardless of ability to pay. And this isn't just a Wyoming issue, this is a national issue that is confronting adolescent behavioral health systems and child welfare systems and juvenile delinquency systems. The number of available treatment placements is very limited. And so when we have some of these complex cases, the conversation is how do we piecemeal all of this together so that we can get the child the best that we can, understanding that access is limited. Another hole in the system are DFS voluntary cases. We receive right now federal funding to pay for children who are in our custody. Up until just recently, we haven't had a lot of funding to help pay for services before kids come into care. So a lot of what we do at this level is case management. So the voluntary cases for kids in this area are similar to what we do in adult protective services. We try to do a lot of resource management. We try to do a lot of connection, a lot of case management, but it's all voluntary. The family is working with us voluntarily. They're not obligated to work with us through the court. One of the bigger problems with that conversation is that because we're working with them voluntarily and because they're not in DFS custody, they're not otherwise eligible for Medicaid. So that trigger of Medicaid coming into our system is a pretty big deal. Another part of the holes is that there's no step-down services for non-DFS involved Medicaid youth. So if you go back to that slide about what Medicaid will pay for, and there's all the dark above and the dark below, the residential treatment center services that we purchase, a non-DFS child cannot access that unless a parent's willing to provide private payment. But typically, there is usually not a private payment source unless there's insurance, but that is few and far between, I'm assuming. So that step down, when you have a child who's on Medicaid at a very high level of psychiatric care, there really isn't much available to that child in terms of stepping down. They go from that high level of care home. We have worked with our group home providers and have restructured the funding to our group homes so that at least that level of care is now available to children who are not DFS custody. So we've changed the funding mechanism a little bit, and so there are now beds that are available to children who are not in DFS custody, who are stepping down from a PRTF level, and that payment is made by the state. And then adolescents with behavioral health challenges placed in juvenile detention centers. And Mr. Chairman, that was the population that you were asking about. At the boys' school right now, we've seen 12-year-old placements. The placements of 12-year-olds double since last year. What those children have been placed in the boys' school for is failure to comply, which is an indication of failure to comply with the probation order, the court order, and therefore are moving into the boys' school because there's no other placement. They are awaiting placement. So these children are in the boys' school awaiting a more appropriate placement, but until that placement becomes available, this is where they will be and this is where they'll be safe. They'll have their educational needs met. They'll have some therapeutic interventions, but really what they are needing is a much higher level of care than what's available currently. So then the last slide is the so what. And this is what is the role of state government in all of this. So what is needed? What services are needed and in what quantity? Who can provide those services? And what's the role in ensuring that those services are available? We've made the system very complicated in that we require all sorts of eligibility criteria to access services. You have to be eligible to access DFS services in that there's a court order in place. You have to be eligible to access Medicaid services, by the most part due to financial reasons. You have to have eligibility to access BOCES service by having a high educational need and behavioral health need. So we've created all of these doors to get these services, but you have to have those magic keys to access. What's left out then is a general population that has a potential to escalate into a situation then the family's forced to use one of these systems to get their child help. And Mr. Chairman, is the presentation on the overall DFS view.
Committee, I think there will be some follow-up conversation as Stefan goes through that. I think we can, and Laurel goes through that, then we can ask our questions because they'll be tied to all three agencies as, who are these and what efforts and where do we put them now? So Director Johansson, would you go into your presentation?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I know we had a slide deck too. I won't belabor every point in there because much of it is somewhat duplicative of what Director Schmidt went over in terms of characteristics of some of the systems and frankly some of the breakdowns. But to begin, I would say that my discussion here is kind of anchored in this complex case discussion. The system, as Corin mentioned, is very complex. There's a lot of players, a lot of pay sources, a lot of rules and regulations. But I think what has generated this topic is we have a relative handful of kids at any given time between agencies that don't fit neatly into some of these system categories that we struggle as a state not only to place in appropriate settings, but to provide care for. So for those who might be following along, on slide number 19 of the department's overall presentation, the recent case characteristics, again, is somewhat duplicative of what Corin mentioned, but a lot of crossover between agencies, and typically we're looking at adolescents from the age of 11 to 22. I'll remind folks that kids in Medicaid world is not just up to 18. It's a little bit different in terms of how we think of childhood eligibility. But some of the characteristics, as Corin mentioned, you have Department of Family Services custody cases and those where there's not custody. Maybe DFS is involved, at least aware of it, or working on a voluntary basis. We also have Department of Education involvement, often with out-of-district placements. As Corin mentioned, we have justice-involved youth where we might have a child in a detention center with some of these characteristics and diagnoses and behaviors that we'll get into shortly. Also, as we were discussing this morning, we see children coming through this system in the way that, again, I'm naively describing as these complex cases or complicated cases where there's intellectual and developmental disabilities. So often our healthcare financing and Medicaid program is involved on the waiver side, but we see breakdowns in that coverage or an unwilling provider or a provider discharging a client for various reasons. And so that, again, adds to some of the complexity of these cases when you do have an ID or a DD diagnosis. And again, as we've mentioned before, I think it's worth pointing out guardianship is sometimes an issue with these complex cases as well. On slide 20, just from our perspective in the Department of Health and the system breakdowns, I already mentioned the DD side with our comprehensive and supports waiver. We, as everybody knows, often run into a case where we have a lack of providers or exclusionary criteria from those providers, and certainly not diming anybody out here on the record, but whether it's in-state providers or out-of-state providers at various levels of care, there's exclusionary criteria that particular provider or business might have at that time. We're not taking females right now. We're not taking males right now. We don't serve this age group. We don't serve this diagnosis. We won't serve or place this child because of legal liability reasons due to the extreme behaviors and potential damage and liability to the building. It really is a long list of issues that we run into, and I think between the two agencies that are, for lack of a better term, case managing the child, I would say daily, if not weekly, we run into these types of exclusionary criteria. And then just on the overall continuum of care, as Director Schmidt mentioned, lack of services or facilities or providers at both ends of the continuum, depending on where the child is at that point. Step-down care is often mentioned from when you're either leaving an inpatient psych or a PRTF type setting, and then the next step in the continuum is home. That can present a challenge with maybe something in the middle being needed or frankly being recommended by a care team. And then obviously difficulties in funding placements. As I mentioned before, we all work within our constraints, and those are both financial and rules and regulations, especially in our world and Department of Health on the federal side. As I mentioned, some of these clients that we're talking about might be on or potentially eligible for our developmental disability waiver programs, but there are very strict criteria of what we can and can't do through the waivers, what we can and cannot fund through the waivers, especially when you get into discussions about institutional placements, which obviously home and community-based services were established as kind of the alternative or even the antithesis of that. But what I'll mention there, as it's certainly listed here as a breakdown, but it's also an opportunity because over the past couple of years, I think we've stepped up efforts between the agencies here when we have those difficulties in funding placements to, for lack of a better term, get creative and braid funding sources that might be non-traditional, whether those are state-only funds between both departments. I know Director Schmidt and her team have worked hard to incorporate other funding that flows to their agency to try to help support things like transportation and other items that can really just assist in the logistics of finding a more suitable placement for a child. But it really has taken, and I'm getting somewhere with this, I promise, it really has taken some creativity and some willingness on the part of the agencies to come to the table with some money in the pockets and say we can use this money more creatively to open up some doors that might not be there based on the traditional program restrictions, whether those are state or federal. The next couple of slides, we won't have to linger on these, but just for reference material for the task force, you can see a large map of some of our in-state providers that are relevant to these types of cases, including group homes, crisis stabilization, PRTFs, residential treatment centers, et cetera, just to give you a little bit of a visual of where these are in state. And going to the next slide, you can see our out-of-state PRTFs, of which I believe we have 9 that are enrolled currently. Look to my folks to correct me if I'm wrong there. But this is not the panacea of all the providers that we try to leverage nationally in some of these cases, but typically the out-of-state psychiatric residential treatment facilities that are enrolled and can be an option for placement. But again, I'll reiterate, this doesn't mean that we always have access to Provo. It is case dependent and case specific, depending on that child, depending on their wait list, depending on what clinical services they have at that particular time. Slide number 23 shows our out-of-state providers broken down, both by provider type and primary payer, as well as our in-state number of beds. Again, as part of that network, doesn't mean that that's the supply of beds we always have, but the beds that are in theory available, and in parentheses, the number of providers that bed count represents. So just a little bit of background data there. But moving on and wrapping up, going back to our system breakdowns, the status quo right now, which I think has generated interest in this topic and this task force taking it up, is that we're reacting. And again, I'm really speaking about these complex cases, this tippy top of the pyramid, 15 to 20 kids at any given time. And I know the discussion about the whole system and continuum is much broader than that, but my comments are really based on those really intense, complex, and often crisis cases that we're trying to deal with. The agencies are collaborating, as I mentioned, to leverage different funding sources. But we have to mention our behavioral health division, and some of the staff that are here today Matt Petrie is here. Reagan Latham has really taken on the torch of coordinating a lot of these non-traditional complex cases for the Department of Health, and has done excellent work in leveraging what we have and looking creatively at what we can do. But we don't receive specific funding or programming for that type of case. We just don't. Doesn't mean we don't work on it. Doesn't mean we don't have coverages or financing in pockets that are available, but it's not specific. And it speaks to that. What problem are we trying to solve? What's the role of the state when we're talking about these relative handful of kids? It's not lined out in a policy that when the Department of Health, Department of Family Services, Department of Education see a case that meets these conditions or that we're trying to resolve placement in this type of way, there isn't a program for that. So we are braiding. We are looking to leverage sources, funding and programming that we have that can be used differently. As I mentioned, some of the barriers, we do have a limited network of approved facilities. And I would say both in-state and out-of-state, that's a common issue. And the regulations regarding, as I mentioned, allowable uses of Medicaid or waiver dollars, which is why you'll hear Corin and I from time to time and our staff talk about, state-only funds or funds that we've carved out that wouldn't be specific or subject to some of those restrictions or regulations. And finally, on the last or second to last penultimate slide, you can see that broken down in a more complex eye chart here. But similar to what Director Schmidt went over with some of those services and the payers, you can see what's being leveraged and what's possible. So some of this is redundant with what Director Schmidt mentioned, but may be helpful to look at the listing of what we're essentially in the Department of Health and Department of Family Services and Education. What's our menu of options, so to speak, when we are dealing with a case? And where are these program areas where we can leverage either financing or services? And it really is quite broad. You can see there's Medicaid, there's Medicaid waiver here, there's state-only Medicaid funds where we essentially do a single use or single case agreement with a provider that's not enrolled to try to open up a bed and funding for that bed for a child. I'll also highlight the Life Resource Center and the state hospital. As Representative Larson and the legislators on this panel know well, we've gone through a pretty monumental effort to rebuild and remission our state hospital and our Life Resource Center with new facilities and a reinforcement of what populations that they will serve. And in some cases, we do use the Life Resource Center to provide services to a high needs, very complex adolescent. That is not something that is specifically missioned for the Life Resource Center. It's absolutely not something that's missioned for the state hospital. And I am acutely aware and know that that is frustrating when we deal with some of these cases that the state hospital says no. A child, a 14-year-old is Title 25'd, and the state hospital is not an option. I know that for folks in the field, for folks in hospitals or detention centers, often that does not make sense, but we are not staffed. We do not have specialty at the state hospital, and the rebuild and the remission was not specific to kids for either of those two facilities. And I don't mention that to just be the stick in the mud that says, we don't do that, sorry, find something else. But I think it's relevant to this discussion when we talk about, to put it in Stefan terms that Stefan can understand, and it has to be simple. In these complex cases, these crisis cases, and Director Schmidt knows how I'm going to describe this, again, just so I can understand it, we're often looking, it's a very painful, emotional circumstance with a child where we're looking for a placement or a setting that's marginally better than a jail or an emergency room, where there's no treatment and it's frankly just absolutely not ideal. All of this complexity, especially with this population, that's how I frame it, is through all of these resources or lack thereof. That's what we're essentially, the problem we're trying to solve is when Corin and I and Laurel and Department of Education get calls at 4 o'clock on a Friday that there's a kid in crisis, and all we have is a detention center, and the detention center saying no, or the emergency room or hospital is saying no more, we're discharging. That's essentially what we're trying to do. Do we have a place, do we have a provider, wherever that might be, that can provide more adequate care and more safety and treatment than a jail, detention center, or a hospital? And that, I think, speaks to the policy question that this group is taking up, which is, what is the role of the state in that safety net? And there's a variety of different answers to that. Is it a state building? Is it a facility? Is it an addition to a facility's mission? Is it a partnership with private providers leveraging what we have with with providers in the communities that can or could do this type of work where we have a place to go for a relative handful of kids that makes more sense than a jail or a detention center. And finally, after that nuclear bomb of pessimism, my final slide on slide 26, I want to talk about some of those successes, because through the partnership and through some of this creative thinking, ideas that are similar to the behavioral health redesign that's more broad, but really through partnership between the agencies and a little bit of creative thinking, we have had some successes and demonstrable successes. We've seen community mental health centers step up in some cases. One that's particularly on my mind that I won't go into any detail on, that really was a very good example of what I mentioned before: multiple, if not dozens, of facility denials all over the country, extreme behaviors, and a blowing out of a facility that was across the entire way across the country, a facility that ended up shutting down that was brand new, but could not handle the population or had issues both financially, operationally, et cetera. We were at a loss, and through some braiding of funding, through some partnership between agencies, through some dedicated work from my staff and a community mental health center stepping up, those services were provided in a way that did not meet, I don't think, any definition of what we see in policy manuals or service manuals. And that's been, to date, an extreme success for a young child that is now on the track to what we hope is a successful and independent life. So this, I don't want to get mired in all of the problems when we can, even with the status quo, we can see some really incredible success. Like I mentioned, that certainly from my perspective, the increased collaboration between the agencies and just taking these cases and elevating them to the leadership level with directors on meetings, or our senior staff on meetings to coordinate what could be useful has been very, very positive. As I mentioned, we're leveraging or trying to leverage different provider types, looking at capacity in a different way that isn't as stringent as how they might be defined in our traditional or historical manuals or understandings of what those care levels are. But we have a bed here. We have a bed that's secure, and we have these provider types that are available or potentially available. Let's try that. And that really is through working with others, or in conjunction with others to make that happen. There's a lot of cooks in this kitchen, and sometimes we have these policy discussions and we add more cooks, and that's not always a bad thing. But I'll close there and see if there's any questions for the Department of Health. But Mr. Chairman, I do think that hopefully cues up the discussion for this task force on given some of those cases, some of those kids, and some of how we describe them. I know Director Schmidt has a very nice policy brief that gets into more detail on the kind of demographics and diagnoses of these complex cases that we can certainly get into. It really does cue up the question of what is the role of state government in these cases? Do we have what we need, or how should we leverage state resources to support those kids? And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll stand for any questions.
We'll hold off on questions, and Laurel, you're up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So much has been said already. The Department of Education, right, really focuses on ensuring that even while these kids are in crisis, right, they still have access to the educational services. So we spend a lot of time, right, working with students that are court-ordered placed or medically placed in the PRTFs, and ensuring that they have high-quality instruction and education, even while they're going through and working through some of the mental health and other crises that they're dealing with. So part of what the Department of Education does as we go through this is we go and we visit all of the institutions where students are placed and ensure that they have the education resources and the supports in place to be able to effectively work with and ensure students are continuing to learn as we go through that. So we do a lot of work with that. We've been working closely, obviously, with the departments here, as well as with BOCES and school districts, to make sure that when students are placed, like on private placements and things like that, that we have all of the pieces in place associated with that to make sure that there's success as we go through that. We also work with ensuring transitions, right, as we transition from like when they are in the facilities and making their way back into their local school districts, ensuring that they are not falling through the cracks as we go through that as well, because we want to make sure that they're able to successfully transition back into their resident school district. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to leave it there, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Okay. Questions, committee? Please. Please.
So, Mr. Chairman, you know, and I've dug into this at various times, and it just, you can't get a handle on it. And kind of the direction I went was through the BOCES stuff and all the players that are in the game. And I don't really still, after all this time, understand the difference really between that and an RTC as far as populations. You know, I guess, is there some, what I would ask the experts here that have to deal with these children, is there some glaring gap that we can try to bridge? And if so, what is that and how do we bridge it? You know, and one struggle I had with the BOCES is, you know, in statute, you know, you can get property tax, right? It's $500,000. But not every district will even assess the $500,000. We don't make them assess the $500,000. And so you end up, you know, and the one closest to me is the one in Jackson. And so you go up there and you look at the facilities. And if I was looking at that facility from the WDE's perspective, right? And I looked at the facility itself, I would say we don't have a school in this state that is in that condition, though it's been taken very good care of. So I don't know how we bridge all these different things. But I guess, having said that, what can we do? What is the biggest gap we have? Let's throw some mud in it.
So before, maybe I'll take a stab at that if I can, because this is an issue that I've kind of been dealing with now for 3 or 4 years, asking the same questions every night about 2 in.the.morning when you're staring at the ceiling. And I think what we have to recognize statewide is bridging the agencies, what we have for a system to take care of kids with behavioral needs is not state agencies per se, but more private agencies funded by the state. And so as we refer to an RTC or a PRTF or to a private hospital or an out-of-state facility for an educational placement or any of these placements, they may have the ability to take that individual or they may not. And even more refined is they have the authority to say, we won't. So they don't have, there's nothing statutorily that requires someone to, and so what we've seen in some cases, for example, is perhaps a child that's been in a BOCES program from a child up till they start developing and starting to see some, you know, changes in their life, and they get big and they get aggressive, and all of a sudden they don't want this child to be there anymore because they have these difficult behaviors that they can't handle anymore, and there's nothing there to require them to continue keeping that individual. So then they lash out. They either law enforcement comes and takes them, puts them in a psych unit where they get stabilized, and then when they go to return them, they say, no, we're done, and then they come back into the school district or back into the community. And so what we're trying to say in this conversation is perhaps the system as a whole isn't broke, but there's this gap where in this situation arises, and Reagan gets a call or Director Lindsay gets a call, this time of day on a Friday afternoon and says, we've got this kid, where can we put them? And I think we've all agreed over the years that the county jail's not the place, that the hospitals really aren't the place, and there's statutorily, it's not the place because they're not getting the treatment that they need, they're not getting the education that they need. There's those things that just are not fit. So then, how do we respond to that, to where we're ready at a given moment to accept this individual on a temporary basis, to stabilize them and to identify and put them in a facility or a location that is appropriate for their condition? So we've identified in the information that Director Schmidt has that we, 15 of these at any given time around the state. And so we're constantly working where we place those, and we've really pulled some rabbits out of our hat and done some good things to get some of these kids placed. But you'll see that they're rejected 25, 30 times around the nation. And so that may take 90 days or 6 months to get them there. So if you have a facility and you're talking about a small population, but you're talking about 2 genders, so you can't, they've got to be able to be segregated, and you have to have the ability 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, staff-wise, because you don't know when they're coming and you don't know when they're leaving. And so do we have, so then you have to look at the physical asset. Where is there a building that you could do that? And then the second thing is, where do we have the staffing to do that? Or where do you locate it where you have the capacity to get the staffing? Or do you put out an RFP and contract with an existing community mental health provider or youth service association group that says, this is the contract, give us a bid, but once you got them, and if you do that and say, but once you got them, you got them. That's part of your contract. Have to keep them. All of that's fair, but we don't have it in place now. And so that's the bridge, Speaker Summers, that we're trying to, that's really the hole in the system, is if we can manage that group on a temporary basis until Department of Health and everybody can find a more appropriate placement for them. That's really, in this whole system that we have with our RTCs, our BOCES, our PRTFs, which does a wonderful job around the state, that's the gap that we have that we're trying to resolve. And so as we think about that, on your drive to Pinedale, how do we do that? And that'll be, I think, what we're trying to do. Director Johansson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Speaker Summers, I agree. I would answer your question about the gaps in this system for these kids in 2 ways. One, we talked about the status quo, and the status quo, I think, has improved through some of that coordination and collaboration and creativity. But if we just take the fact that we have kids in placements now, in state and out of state, at higher levels of care, recognizing that they won't be there forever, or they will be discharged, or they need to be discharged from that level of care. I think building in the community supports that are necessary at a non-institutional or a lower level of care, wraparound services for the kid and the family is absolutely crucial for even the status quo right now. There's an element of that in the behavioral health redesign that impacts the community mental health centers to target high needs kids and their families, but it also involves a lot of other entities and partners where we can, I think, build additional supports for kids that are coming out of higher levels of care or need to come out. Then secondly, a second point would be a full agreement with Chairman Larson. I think the discussion of what the safety net is in terms of a physical plant for these 10 to 20 children at any given time is an important policy consideration that can take a lot of different angles, some of which our chairman alluded to, that I'm somewhat agnostic to what that ultimately becomes, but as I mentioned, in an oversimplified manner, we're looking for a marginally better setting than a detention center or an emergency room. And I think to Representative Larson's point, whether that's a state facility or we look at a state asset or a contracted asset that has space, where rooms are up to code, relatively secure, and crucially that there's staffing available for that type of adolescent care. I think that's what a task force like this, I welcome being able to have that discussion. And it's tough for me personally, because we've just built 3 Department of Health facilities, and I'm horrified that there could potentially be a 6th. But and I say that in jest, because facilities are hard to run. They're hard to run in this state, and they're hard to staff. We all know that. But I think that's the second component of a gap that I certainly see is we are reacting and coordinating during a time where a child is in a setting that nobody would agree is appropriate, like a jail or a detention center. And I think we need to discuss those options as a task force. I will say that in a handful of cases, as I mentioned, we have leveraged the Life Resource Center, and they've stepped up on a few very extreme cases over the past couple of years as somewhat of a pilot to test, okay, in an emergency situation, what if it was a state facility? And our administrator and the staff there were somewhat voluntold over the past year, 18 months, this child's coming, and I won't get into the details for privacy reasons, but significant behaviors, extreme autism, things of that nature, that on a very minor scale, we wanted to study. And we don't have a comprehensive study about it, but we've put together information, which happy to share with this committee, that can give us a sense as a group, whether it was a state facility or whether we contracted it out, procured it, what does it take in some of these cases with these demographics and these diagnoses and behaviors? What does it take on the cost side? What does it take on the staffing side? What does it take on the expertise and the layering of special education and educational services? And we have that. And on average, just to give the committee something to react to or to cognitively map it, because it's helpful for me, with some of our recent cases, a 3-month stay, I would estimate at around 40 grand. With what the Life Resource Center provided, just in rough estimated fixed costs, right? Our staffing ratio for these kids, especially in the early admission, being 2 to 1, and what that takes 24/7. And we can model that out. We can model what that means by state salaries in those positions that are there. We modeled out food costs and building fences and things of that nature. But I think, again, it's not written in stone. But the reason I bring up that 3-month, 40 grand, so you're $10,000 to $15,000 a month for some of these very high needs cases, is because in a few out-of-state placements where we were looking at Medicaid single-use agreements or single case agreements, we're looking at, in some cases, of an excess of $1,500 a day. That quickly gets into 6 figures, sometimes on a monthly basis. Not always, but sometimes. And over that same 3-month period, looking at $100,000, $150,000, $200,000 for a placement to be able to have access to a bed. That's not the norm, but it's absolutely a possibility. And especially over the past couple of years, Director Schmidt would confirm the costs get exorbitant with how everybody's dealing with staffing issues. So I bring it up as just a point of relativity to think about, just on the dollars and cents side. What's not only the appropriate use of government, whether it's a facility that we own or contract for, but also on the efficiency side, when we deal with these cases, and sometimes they reach into the 6 figures of what it takes to get someone to Ohio or Alabama for a placement, where we kind of lose some state ownership of that case. I think that should inform this task force on that policy decision about how the state cares for these kids in the short term and on a temporary basis.
Mr. Chairman, to augment that conversation about what this role of the state is, and as we talk about what those needs are, I think we also have to be pretty brutally honest with ourselves about what our capacity is to serve those children and for how long. Some of the youth that we're serving that are at any one of these temporary placements really does need a high level of care that I don't think Wyoming could ever provide. It's so specialized, it's so unique to that child. However, access is an issue trying in that waiting game. And in the meantime, while you're waiting for that level of care, where can we have kids that are at least getting that marginally better? I hope we could do better than marginal, but but understanding that, as we think about our needs, it's both a temporary placement, and the conversation is, but what about a long-term placement as well? And that has a combination of services. So there's that space right now, and there's a brief in your book about those 12 to 15 kids, and I think it really is a good example of the variety of needs that we're seeing through these kids, but all of them are complex. And all of them require a lot of care, 2-on-1s, 3-on-1s. They're staff intensive, they're treatment intensive, they're educationally intensive. So while it's not a lot, it is a population that is incredibly difficult. And then when you talk about Wyoming and the resources we have and the sparseness of who we are, it is even compounded.
So, Mr. Chairman, one other question I would have is, are we seeing an increasing use of placing children out of state? And I bring this up, just one is, I don't think that's the best solution. It might be in Salt Lake if you're in Evanston, if the parent, and if they have parents, right? Some of these children don't even have anybody around. But I really wonder, is that increasing, and is that in any of your opinions concerning? Because it's concerning to me if it's happening, because I would hate to see us serve our children elsewhere where families can't get to them.
So it's over the last few years that I've been involved in this, Representative Summers, I've not seen it increase as much as who has the capacity nationwide. There's just a capacity problem nationwide, and there's an absence of capacity in Wyoming for some of these really complex cases. And, the one reference Director Johansson talked about that we looked at the Life Resource Center, which is a very, very difficult case, actually is driving this whole conversation. It came about several years ago. He finally aged out. And we have to remember that these kids continue to, so then they come out of that adolescent programs, and then you've got to be ready for, and can they be in the community in Mr. Gardner's program? Some of them, yes. And getting them stabilized to do that. And so they're just at this point in their life and doing that, but finding the places is the bigger challenge on some of these complex cases. And I might add, Representative Summers, that on this one kid, the only place we searched nationwide for a couple of years, finally found a place in New York, upstate in New York, that would take him. Finally, and just decided, because he was about a year or year and a half from aging out, just maybe that wasn't the best thing culturally and family-wise and everything else. So those are all decisions. Director Johansson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Speaker Summers, it was just confirming with my team over there, a little bit of good news, but caveated with some interesting information. So over the past 10 years, we've actually trended down in the number of kids at the PRTF, Psychiatric Residential Treatment Facility level, that we've placed out of state. That's for a variety of reasons. Sometimes we're looking at an out-of-state placement and that's needed, because we don't have that level of care or that provider expertise or bed open here. And the out-of-state provider won't enroll with Wyoming Medicaid because they won't accept our rates. So there's a variety of reasons of why those numbers have gone down, but I do know, especially at the Department of Health level, there's been concerted efforts to do what we can to serve the kids closest to home as possible. But bearing in mind, we have 2 PRTFs in Wyoming, and those exclusionary criteria do come into play with who they will and won't accept. That and if a physician or an MDT is recommending that level of care for a child, then the Department of Health and Family Services are looking for that level of care, regardless of where it is, if that's what's needed. But to Representative Larson's point, I think it's important to remember that with those exclusionary criteria that we have in state and out of state now, which we struggle to find appropriate placements for kids, in envisioning what the solution could look like, if it's not, the role of the state to have its own facility or building that would serve this type of purpose, then resolving those exclusionary criteria with a provider, with a contractor, so to speak, would be absolutely necessary, so that we don't set up a safety net program where this is the role for when we have a child, and then we basically get back to the status quo that is, well, we don't have that level of expertise, we don't take males of this age, we don't take these behaviors, we don't take this type of diagnosis. That's really the tension here. But yeah, the numbers for out-of-state placements at that level of care have trended down.
And just before we take public comment, I mean, this is 15 kids that have lived under the radar. Really, we've not addressed this, and that just gives me angst. I know there's a lot of, yeah. So I think we're getting close. Okay, public comment. Do we have anybody online, Katie? Any public comment? Andy, please.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, while she's getting set up.
You may.
I know Director Schmidt has staff here too. I did want to let the task force know I've got several staff from Behavioral Health Division and Healthcare Financing, should you have any questions. Appreciate you all being here, and frankly, between DFS, Health, and Education, we wouldn't have some of these successes we can talk about without the work of those folks sitting there. So wanted to recognize them, and feel free to berate them with questions as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This topic has been on the radar of the community mental health centers in particular for a couple of years, as it came up and started the conversation with behavioral health redesign. Speaking to a couple of points from earlier, there is a specific piece in behavioral health redesign that says the community mental health centers can serve under that tier 1 category children that are being discharged from PRTFs or from acute psychiatric facilities. So we are trying to create that step down care in a sense to the community. But in the meantime, the bigger issue is we still need somewhere for these 10 to 15 kids to go. As the director spoke earlier, Director of Department of Health, my apologies, there's a lot of directors here today. As the director spoke, we've had some of these adolescents come into the community mental health system. And it's been, experiment is not the right word, but it has been interesting to see how the providers have been able to put things together that maybe they hadn't thought of in the past, to be able to keep these kids in state, closer to their families. And these kids, some of them have been able to go back to their communities after a stay with the community mental health centers. Now, I won't sit here today and tell you that the facilities are everything that we dreamed they were for these children that we have held on to, but it has worked. So I want to talk just a little bit about the perspective from the clients, from the families and these kids. Out-of-state placements are incredibly hard. If there are families involved, it's certainly always better to have them closer as part of the treatment, keep these families together as much as we possibly can. A number of these types of kids are going to come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, which means if they are out-of-state placed, it becomes difficult, if not impossible, for family or parents to travel. And as much as the departments and everybody works together to try that, make that happen, it's not an ideal situation. So from our perspective, from a client advocacy standpoint, every kid that we can serve in state is a win. And we think that that should be a consideration of the committee. Now, I also cannot sit here and tell you that we can serve absolutely every single one of these kids. To Director Schmidt's point, there are going to be some cases where we just don't have the expertise that we need. Extreme autism cases sometimes come up. A few other things where we really do need a different type of specialty and that child needs a different type of care. I think our goal would be to try to reduce that number that are going out of state to just those few cases, ideally. In the last 2 years, there's been a lot of conversation, both with the legislature, and that has generated conversation out with the community mental health centers about what do we do with these kids. What I've seen in the last 6 months is several of these providers, so they are BOCES, youth providers, and community mental health centers, come together and start to talk on their own about how they do this in partnership. I can tell you today that I think it's possible. I think it is possible and feasible to serve the majority of these kids within the state of Wyoming. To keep my comments fairly short, the discussion we've had recently is maybe we should ask the state to release an RFI or an RFP and ask the providers to go ahead and put those plans together and get them in front of the state departments to begin those discussions. We do think that it is possible and it is in the best interest. The other piece that I would add to that is every piece of the continuum that we can keep whole in Wyoming makes this easier. While I think the goal is always to try to serve these kids, and certainly under behavioral health redesign is to grab these, my apologies, grab these kids before they get to this level. Let's intervene earlier. Let's get them earlier services. That's also part of behavioral health redesign. There's a section in here that allows for essentially referral from a variety of sources. For a child can be referred by a crisis shelter, a school, primary care provider, licensed therapist, or law enforcement officer for treatment for mental illness or substance use disorder that impacts the child's life. That's a doorway to get them in earlier. We need to continue to build on that. But every piece of the continuum that we can keep whole here in Wyoming helps us serve our Wyoming families better. So, Mr. Chairman, I would just, I guess I would just end my comments there with, we think it is possible, and we think it's possible now and in the immediate future, but we would need to have a mechanism to start those conversations directly with the departments to put that together. I'd stand for questions.
Questions from Ms. Somerville?
Mr. Chairman.
Please.
Andy, how much is that going to cost to serve all these kids?
Mr. Chairman, Director Johansson, isn't that maybe the $1 million question, right?
I think it's more of a $50 million question.
Yeah, I hope not. Director Johansson, I certainly hope it's not $50 million. When the discussion has taken place, the way that has been looked at is not necessarily to build an independent facility that's just for these kids, to fully staff a facility that's just for these kids. You're talking about having a child psychiatrist and a bunch of other special personnel that you have to keep staffed and on 24/7 because you don't know when they're going to show up and you don't know how long they're going to stay. The model that we think that is more effective is to essentially build it into other programs that already exist. So there would be some facility components to that piece that would probably build onto campuses that already exist. And then essentially those campuses and those programs would share staffing. So if a community mental health center already has a child psychiatrist on staff, maybe they need 1.5 child psychiatrists to make this work. They can move that staff depending on who's there. Because the other thing in community mental health centers is, although outpatient is pretty steady and SUD residential is pretty steady, crisis stabilization, there's a number of other programs where we have to do the same thing. If you just hire staff to have them sit and wait for the client to show up, that's a poor use of dollars. That's a poor use of resources. So you really have to make those programs work together, and you use those staff across a variety of programs. We would do the same thing. So my hope is that the rate with the exclusion of education would be somewhere near what a crisis stabilization rate is.
So hypothetically, Andy, if the state departments released an RFI or an RFP, you believe there would be organizations in some geographies of the state that would respond to that saying, we have a space, we have staff for if the mission were developed for some sort of temporary care for high needs adolescents while other placement arrangements are being made, that there would be response to that?
Mr. Chairman, Director Johansson, I do. I'm confident in that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Andy, is the thinking along this idea that understanding that one of the largest difficulties we have is the ability for a private provider to say no? And so, as we are always looking for placements and for whatever the exclusionary criteria, as Director Johansson mentioned, this would be a service, whereas no is not an option. So considering that, then what is it that you're thinking you can do to solve for that problem when it doesn't appear we've been able to solve for it before?
Mr. Chairman, Director Schmidt, to the entire committee, as we had these conversations, I think I opened every discussion and meeting with, you can't say no. I just need you to keep that in mind, whatever you want to talk about, you have to take these kids. So that's pretty well known. I think that the mechanism that you use is through a contract. So the RFP specifically requires that this service be provided, and you can't say no. I think that there would have to be a discussion about that small number of kids that we just don't have that super specialty care for. But what we have seen just in the kids that have come into the community mental health system is a phenomenal working relationship with DFS and DOH to talk about these kids and figure out what that looks like. Now, maybe that's a restriction of the number of kids that can be said no or something, but I think it's a contract mechanism.
Mr. Chairman, a follow-up. So I think, yes, you can't say no. But the other part that really confounds us, at least on the Department of Family Services side, is that we're obligated also for education. And the way that we access education is, quite honestly, very difficult. We have quarter placement statutes that say the Department of Ed shall, but when we have some of these extremely complex cases where children are on an IEP and all of that comes into play, it gets very tricky very quickly. So as you're contemplating this level of service, you're also contemplating a whole mix of federal requirements around FERPA, around IDEA, and other places that are going to also have to be considered. So is that a conversation you've had?
Mr. Chairman, Director Schmidt, so it is, and it's probably from our world of community mental health centers, it's probably the piece that we were most unfamiliar with in terms of providing that educational component. Without calling out any specific one, I will let you know that BOCES has been a tremendous resource to us in that conversation. They have expertise in how to run that particular piece. I think that they would be an important partner to have at the table or a similar type agency. I don't know that it would, I think it could work, but if I was, in charge, I would say I probably wouldn't want to put it all on a provider to design another, particularly K-12 program that had to operate for these 10 to 15 kids, may or may not be there, when we could be better, more successful with a resource that already exists. And Mr. Chairman, to that point, if I can add, location will be an important factor of being able to staff it and to have these partnerships. And so I just want to put that out there. I don't think it's a partnership system we can duplicate in every corner of the state. I think it's going to be to a few select regions that have these partners available.
Please,
One more follow-up?
please.
Thank you. So I'm going to call out our own system here, but one of the concerns I have about kind of creating a facility is that build it and they will come. And then there's this tendency then to rely solely on that and then forgo what I think is important, and to kind of punctuate what Director Johansson said, is that very individualized care that can be provided in a community so a child can stay safe at home. And so there's this balance then about having the services, but also not overbuilding the services so that what we're doing is creating more institutionalization of kids, which is an issue. I think the state has done a tremendous job in reducing the number of placements, in the state not being just government. Wyoming as a whole has done a really good job of reducing the number of placements of kids in these types of facilities unnecessarily. So teasing out then that necessary versus unnecessary population, also wondering if there's been some thought given to how is it then that you manage or that you force back on the agencies to manage populations when it's starting to be a replacement for what really could be provided in community.
Mr. Chairman.
Our directors want all the answers now.
Now they do. I'm pedaling fast here. So to that point, I think that's an important conversation, and yes, we've touched upon it, right? How do you keep the children at the correct level of care with the goal of let's get them the services they need and let's move them back down through the system. If it's possible, let's get them home. Let's get them back into their communities. That's where they're going to thrive the most at the end of the day, is at home and with their communities. In terms of what safeguards do we put in place, I don't think I have an answer for you today, but it is part of the conversation. And I think it's also a resource utilization part of the conversation too, specifically to the facilities question. Do you build a standalone facility? Maybe you don't, right? Maybe you build a piece onto a very small piece onto a building, or a provider already has that space there that can be retrofitted, that can be, I mean, it's not designed to be 6 months to a year. It's designed to, let's get them some intense services, and can we move them to a PRTF setting? Can we move them to an RTC and start to move them down those steps? I think those are all incredibly important pieces of the conversation. And I think the reason I'm standing here in front of the task force today saying, let's maybe think about asking the state to just release an RFI, is to give these providers the chance to put some pen to paper and get that into you guys, so that you can start to have those particular conversations.
Okay, thank you. Andy, the only thing that I would suggest you slipped in one comment a couple of times, except for. There's no except fors. I mean, we're looking at 100%. We've got to deal with all these people, okay? So I think it's clear to understand, at least, unless you can show me some reason, but because that's the problem we have now, is except for, okay? So you might just share that concern, please.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I will. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Barlow.
Mr. Chairman, and Ms. Somerville doesn't have to respond to this, but I think the except for, we've been asking a lot of questions of Somerville, but I think we need to be asking the questions of ourselves is, what's it costing now? What services are we requiring? And what aren't we getting found? Because I don't know that we can expect someone else to be able to provide something that we're not even able to find ourselves, or we have to be cautious about that. So I think to do an RFI, we're going to have to know what actually we're asking for, what those services are, what kind of intensity, what kind of duration, et cetera, so that when you send something out, these folks know, oh, that's what we're bidding on. That's how it fits with education. That's how it fits with the courts, et cetera. So anyway, except for I'm not even sure what we're doing now. And I think that can be gathered though. We know what we've been paying for. We know what has been required. So let's put that together. So then we can understand what the except fors might be. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Fair enough. Okay.
Mr. Chairman, committee, my name is Nicole Hauser. I'm the Executive Director for Cathedral Home for Children. So I am the provider here at the table that you can lob all of your questions. I'm also a member of WYSA, so Wyoming Youth Service Association, and our director, Bruce Berklin, we let him go on vacation, so I'm here in his stead, but he provided a letter to you all that is in your information, so I'd be happy to address that if you would like. Out of the gate, as a provider, Cathedral Home has been around since 1910. We have worked with some of the most high needs youth across the state, and we serve kids from other states. I will tell you, as a provider, I will not submit an RFI if I would have to accept all. And the reason for that is it's really important to me that I know we can provide a program for kids and meet their needs of themselves or their family. And so when we're looking at certain developmental levels, autism, I know my program is not set up for that. We are an open campus. We serve a certain number of kids, a certain age group. And so to add those type of service modalities into our program, I would not be able to offer those kids what they deserve. So I just want to put that out there as a provider. So I'm going to pick Andy's brain in a little bit, who said they would say yes, because that is something we've talked about with WISA, and that is of concern. But I also hear the concern that you guys are working to address is the needs of these 15 kids. The other big piece of this that I know you all are considering is there's 700 or 1,000 more kids that we want to ensure as providers that they are getting the services that they need, and all of it aren't going, and all the resources aren't going to just 15. When we talk about cost, our reimbursement rate for the services we provide meets nowhere near the cost that it takes to provide the services. We all talk about staffing, providing resources to our staff to make sure we have competent people that want to work in this really difficult work, and we are not where we need to be. The state has not appropriated enough funds to Department of Family Services or Department of Health to meet the needs of the services that we provide. So as it stands, to then ask providers to take on the highest level of kids, it's difficult when I'm losing money as it is serving Wyoming kids. I'll start there. I know there's lots of questions.
Director Johansson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Nicole, good to see you.
Hi.
So I think to Senator Barlow's point, maybe we're getting crossways with what the intent would be. I think the problem is hearing no from providers, and that's not a slight against providers. It's just the reality with these kids that we have those exclusionary criteria, and they're understood what they are. I think some of the confusion might be when we talk about contracting for this type of service provision or facility. It's that state sends a child with these very unique needs, and said provider is going to work with all the specialty services to serve that child. And I think that's ideal if we had that level of care and expertise in Wyoming. But is the sentiment similar on no exclusionary, there has to be exclusionary criteria if the mission were defined, to Senator Barlow's point of here's what we're looking for. On a 3 to 6 month basis, we're looking for, a temporary placement. It wouldn't have specialty autism services or what have you, but it's a place where some education can be provided and better than marginal, but education services, behavioral health services, healthcare services, and general safety and well-being. If we're talking about, that type of partnership with the state, does that change the landscape? And I agree with Senator Barlow entirely that, the work would have to clearly delineate what those expectations would be if we're talking about assigning cases that a contractor can't say no to. I mean, the sentiment from me is, well, at the state institutions, we get court orders for placements, regardless of how we feel about them, and they're coming in. And I think that's the tension here. But maybe the tension isn't so extreme of, well, we need a facility that can do everything for all of these kids, regardless, and you can't say no, is probably not as accurate as we're looking for something where we can coordinate, ongoing services that might not be everything we need now, but for 3 to 6 months have some temporary, a temporarily better placement than a jail or a hospital. What are your thoughts there?
Mr. Chairman? Director Johansson, yes, and I would direct us to the rules that we already have in place as providers through DFS. So if I look at the youth I serve through our crisis center, we have an agreement to basically, as our crisis center, we say yes to just about everyone. We don't define the crisis. There are times, right, if they need medical detox, we would ask that they they do that if they're actively suicidal. Some of those things we're assessing immediate risk. Our group home level of service, we have an agreement with DFS that these are the needs that we're going to address and work with this type of kids. Same at the RTC level. So I believe it's already there, but there is the ability for providers to use our expertise and our discretion where we have to ethically say, I can't meet that need. So if it can be, if it's not just all or nothing, that's what concerns me as a provider.
Albert?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. You said something there, and I'm sure it's true, but I want to understand more about it, and that is, you said we're still losing money. So how do you survive? I mean, it's not a great plan. Is it, do you get enough donations, that you get enough outside money that comes in that helps you support your loss, or how do you maintain?
Mr. Chairman, Speaker Summers, we have to fundraise quite a significant amount, and it never feels enough. Last year, we had to raise over $2 million to meet our operational deficit. And in fact, we are a provider that serves kids from other states. Those service rates, reimbursement rates that we receive meet our cost. So I serve other kids that those states deem as high risk, high needs, because they pay me. They pay our cost. They cover what it costs us to provide that service. So our Wyoming reimbursement rate is not there.
You alluded, Nicole, and you got right down to the crutch of the reason this task force is considering it, because if you don't take them, who does? And that's what we're trying to resolve here.
Yeah.
And so if that's a different approach to what you do, that's all. We've not made a decision, and we've not come here and said you have to do anything, okay? But what we are dealing with is, and we've had these conversations with your group and others over the last couple of years, is what do we do with this? We understand what your contracts say, but we still have 10 to 15 kids that, for ethical or whatever other reasons are out there, you don't take. We've still got to do something with them. So I don't think that, or please, I hope you'll take back to WISA that we're not saying demanding, but we've got to figure this out. And and if you don't want to participate, that's okay. We're not crying foul. We're just trying to figure this out. And we never expected you to come here and say, oh, forgive me, I'll take them all. We know that this is a challenge. We're just trying to figure it out. So I think that's really important, because you guys provide a very essential service. And then, this conversation is more about this population and not on budget right now. We can wrestle him for that, and he can wrestle me for that later. But right now, we're focusing on this population.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Mr. Chairman, one other concept that we've talked about with WISA, and I think this is sticky, is it appears from our perspective that, there is some governmental immunity. So for state-run facilities, and for us private providers, the risk and liability insurance, those costs, loss, there is that we have to consider as well. So I do believe that's something we should talk about in this task force, is maybe that is a better option, is that it is state ran for that protection.
Well, maybe. I read that with some interest in Bruce's comments there. I'd like to see that information. What do those impacts on a facility to be insured mean, or can't you even just, so that was an interesting point. Senator Barlow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I appreciate that we're focusing on this population of very high needs, very unique or high needs individuals. And right now they're going somewhere, whether it's detention, inappropriate, some placement, and appropriate or not, I'm not even going to make a judgment on that. but they're going somewhere. They're somewhere in the system. New York, wherever. I guess my maybe a more fundamental concern I have is with the fact that we have two providers, or there's multiple providers, but two at a PRTF level in the state of Wyoming. And what I'm hearing from one of them right here is that they can't sustain with what they're providing us now based on the reimbursement rates we have. So my question is, should we have a conversation about having a rebasing of PRTF type, or these type of services, RTC, PRTF, just like we do for community, some of our other services that we rely on government funds for and outside providers to do. So I just throw that out there as we're concentrating on this and trying to find a solution to this, but we're gonna have a bigger problem if we lose a PRTF or two in the state of Wyoming, and we have no place to save these folks. So anyway, thank you.
The last rebasing on PRTFs, I think, was 2012. And so that was the rationale behind the 2 years ago in 2022 to bring them up to a level. I don't know that we got them completely where they need to be, but we have been having that conversation. But your point's valid, but just bringing up the fact that it hasn't gone completely unnoticed. Albert, Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, and Senator, I keep want to call him Rep because I'm in with him, but Senator Barlow, that's hard to say. But it really is, it's like a pyramid, right? I mean, we're talking about the peak, and if the base is in jeopardy, the whole thing blows up. And so I'm curious, and I know I've seen these numbers somewhere, but I didn't see them in here, is, how many kids are in these PRTFs, and what is our deficit there compared to what other states pay? And then just my final comment on, the RFP idea is really an RFI idea, right? You're not getting it's not a great risk in that. I think it's really interesting information you could find from it. You might not like anything you find out of it, but I think it's really important to make that effort to see what you can do for those 10 to 15. But I am concerned about where we're at. And heck, we all know it's hard to get money out of us. Lloyd does as good a job as he can do for all of you folks to getting money, and it's not easy. And but if we're at the risk of losing our PRTFs, then we have a bigger problem than the 10 to 15.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I want to make some distinctions about levels of care because that matters in this conversation. So a PRTF level of care is a Medicaid rate, and they've rebased, but you also just did the upper payment, right? Upper payment limit that assists with that. In regard to the services that Cathedral Home and the residential treatment centers provide, there was an appropriation put into our supplemental budget this year, and that we have, thanks to the JAC and a lot of hard work, we have been our 2020 reductions to that particular budget have been reinstated. Part of those dollars then is going to a entity that the Department of Health already contracts with to do an analysis to determine what a rate should be. So this agency in 2016 cut that provision out of its budget because that's when the state was really starting to cut. The argument by the department at the time is saying there's going to be no money. Why are we trying to figure out how much these services cost? So we've reestablished that. The contract is on its way. They have most of the information that they need to do the analysis. We're just paying them to pull in this provider group so that we do have a better sense of what it costs to provide this service. But this is a little bit different. The services that are provided at this level are different at the PRTF in that Department of Health also provides money and the Department of Education also provides money. So the three agencies are putting dollars collectively in this versus a PRTF which is solely paid by Medicaid. So just some distinctions that I think are important, because when we talk about rates, I think what WISA is talking about is the specific rate that the Department of Family Services provides for room and board. It's a different conversation to talk about the rate Medicaid provides, and even a different conversation about the rate Department of Ed provides. So it gets a little sticky.
Yes. Mr. Chairman, may I comment to that? Yes, it is very complicated. Department of Education, we do the cost study that Director Schmidt was referencing, and Department of Education meets our cost for providing educational services at the RTC level. We are in the process right now working with the Department of Health. We've submitted our data. We have had work group studies, so we're kind of working to see those rates. And then to Director Schmidt's point about working to that, I will provide my room and board numbers to you right now. We are reimbursed $180 from Department of Family Services. My room and board cost is $352. So, I mean, there are hotels that cost more than what we are reimbursed for that really vital care. Our treatment costs, so the clinical services we offer, reimburse on average $30 a day, and the cost there far exceeds that. So when I'm talking about where we're sitting, those are just straight numbers that I can give you. We are way off where we need to be. It's not Director Schmidt. Thank you. Thank you all.
Nicole, thanks for being here. Any other public comment? One more section to go. Okay, thank you. Let's move on to mental health services for K-12. And Laurel will turn that. And I'll turn my microphone on. We're going to go to the last section, K-12, student mental health in their K-12 system. And if, Laurel, if we could turn that over to you to kind of just give us a lay of the land and maybe what's some of the things that are taking place.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the Department of Ed really kind of took off and started doing a lot of work on school-based mental health back we tried in 2019 to get a grant, and we're not successful in that bid. But in 2020, we were successful. And we kind of picked up on this because what we're seeing is that we have lots of youth that have major depressive episodes. We have lots of youth that aren't receiving services when they have these episodes. We know that we have children that have private health insurance, but the health insurance doesn't cover the mental health pieces. When we look at Wyoming, they have the highest prevalence rate of youth-based major depressive episodes in the US. When we look at our prevention needs assessment data for the state, 9% of our Wyoming students attempted suicide in the last 12 months. So there's a lot of work, I think, that needs to go on, and we know that.
Hold it, I want to hear that number again.
Mr. Chairman, the prevention needs assessment that's
The percentage of children that attempted to commit suicide, or whatever that was, I want to hear that figure again.
the prevention needs assessment data provided a statistic that 9% of Wyoming students attempted suicide in the last 12 months.
And if we could get the good representative Laurel to go through the chairman.
Sorry
Mr.
about that, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, continue.
So Wyoming, we have been working on trying to think about this as a tiered approach and how we're looking at mental health in schools. We think about like tier 1, so what are we doing and what can we provide for all students, kind of thinking about statewide, or thinking about all students, like what is it they need? What is it we can provide to provide some help and support and services that way? We also think about tier 2, which if you're thinking about students in need of mental health services, we are looking at like group therapy or things like that, or group services as we think about like substance abuse and mental health services. Tier 3 is where we're actually thinking about if a student actually needs to to see a counselor or something like that needing individualized support. So as you kind of, yes, Mr. Chairman. Tier 1 is the kinds of things that we can do for all students. So supports we can put in place to try to see what we can do to keep them from having to go to Tier 2, and then we put the Tier 2 in place to try to keep them from needing Tier 3, but if they need Tier 3, we have those in place as well. So thinking about Tier 1, we just recently are starting a pilot or released what we call our mental and emotional well-being framework, which we call it Thrive, the Thrive framework, which is about thinking through decisions, respect for others, inspiring actions, valuing relationships, elevating oneself, and kind of thinking about how we can help students with that. We have a whole, like if you think about, these are like the competencies we'd like kids to come out with. We also think about then we have to have some of these, what we call our conditions for success, right? So in order for students to have strong mental and emotional well-being, right? The adults in the system also have to have strong mental health and well-being. We need learning and collaboration that's occurring among the adults. We need to make sure that we're engaging with families and parents and the community for students. We talked about the fact that we think it needs a whole tiered system connected to this, as well as when we think about our schools, that they really need to make sure that they have a positive climate and culture throughout that. And so we are working with that. We are getting ready to, we just released the application for districts to come in and give us, who want to participate as part of a pilot. We're looking at trying to have what we call 6 sites participate. A site could be a single school that's interested. It could be a collection of schools in a district. It could be an entire district that may want to look at that. With that, we're providing kind of what we call like our developmental indicators to kind of think about like, what does this look like in K2 versus 3, 5, 6, 8, 9, 12, as well as implementation supports for districts with those conditions for success. When we think about Tier 2 and Tier 3, we're now starting to think about how do we provide mental health services to students, right? It's something a little more intense. So we've been kind of going through do we do this as like hiring mental health providers in schools and just having schools do that, or do we look at partnering with mental health providers and the communities and the like? And I will say, the way we've approached it, we have done partnerships with our mental health providers. And we've kind of done that for a couple of reasons. Some of the pieces that come with that, if you think about like billing and data security, all of those kinds of things that the mental health providers are used to doing that are a little different or not some of the things that we do necessarily in K-12. So we have tried to put that, keep that in the lap of the mental health or the behavioral health providers. We allow them then to be able to hire the FTEs. They can do it through multiple FTEs or one person, right? It may be better for not to just have one mental health provider that may or may not work well with particular students. And so giving them options of mental health providers. So we allow for that as well. And then in the system that we've created, we have ensured that nobody pays, like no families are paying out of pocket for the services. So they also then deal with, if you have health insurance, billing the health insurance companies and things like that for some of the services. So we have several grants that we're actively working on, we have right now. You may hear them sometimes referred to as Project Aware. That's kind of what we've kind of given our whole project that name, but there are specific grants through SAMHSA that we use that that have helped us. So we got our first grant in 2020, but it's a 5-year grant, so we'll go through 2025. We work with 3 school districts in this process. So Campbell County School District number 1, Fremont County School District number 1, and Park County School District number 1. And they work with the behavior health providers in their specific community. So for example, Campbell County is working, or Campbell 1 is working with Kid Clinic, Fremont 1 is working with Path Wellness, Park 1 is working with One Health, right? So they're working in, and they are having their providers, where they do it one of two ways, where the providers either come into the schools, the school makes sure that there is a space for the mental health provider to be able to meet with students. So they do it that way. We also have some districts where they transport the student then to the mental health provider instead. So whichever works better for them. The grant itself is about $9 million over the 5 years. We have a second one that we got in 2021, which is again with 3 school districts. So we are working with Carbon County School District number 1, Sweetwater County School District number 1, and Uinta number 1. And what makes this one a little bit different is that instead of focusing on, some of these communities have very few health providers, mental health or behavioral health providers, and those that they do have are already so tapped, it's very difficult, right, to get students in. And so instead, we have been using a telehealth model. We've been partnering with WBI and Central Wyoming Counseling Center to provide services for the students in these districts. That one, again, is about almost $9 million over the 5 years. We also partnered with the Department of Health to use some of the CDC funds that they had to be able to kind of expand the model that we have into 4 additional districts. So we have them in Park 16, Park Bighorn 1, 2, and 3 are all partnering, all 4 of them are partnering with us on those funds. And as the CDC funds closed out, we are picking up and extending that through some of our ESSER or some of our stimulus funds that we have received to kind of continue that work on that side. We also have been using our ARPA funds to support some of this. So we have Niobrara County School District number 1 and Goshen 1 that are also working with us, kind of using the same kind of model with all of these districts. It seems to be pretty, I'll give you some stats in a second, but they're working out they're working very well. Other than that first year, everybody else is using telehealth. So we've been working with districts to make sure that they have access to the telehealth services. In 2022, so last year, we received another grant through that focused on trauma-informed services. So it's very much the SAMHSA kind of model, but it also wraps in some of the additional support services that come with the trauma-informed services. We're working with Sweetwater 1 and Sweetwater 2 are partnering together in that one to be able to do that. Through these 5 different grants that we have going right now, we are currently serving 29,295 students, which is about 32% of the students in the state. 29,295 students are enrolled in those districts, right? I mean, we're not actually providing services to 29, but those students have access to it. It's been really phenomenal because the districts that are working in these have created these referral pathways so that the kids actually are able to access services in 30 days or less is what we've been finding. And so the wait as we've been going through this is significantly less than what they were experiencing in these school districts before this. So kind of thinking about what our successes are, we have seen 1,400 students since the start of this and since we started providing services since services have been provided beginning in February of 2021. We've actually do a lot of training with school districts, right? Thinking about like youth mental health first aid. I don't know why I struggle with saying that, but we've done, we provide training and stuff like that. So over 1,300 of our personnel across our staff have gone through the training. Like I said, all of our services come to students and their families at no cost. So our grants are written to cover the co-pays or the underinsured, as well as the uninsured students, and those that are fully insured, right? So we make sure that that's coming without a cost to the families. One of the other things that we have seen is that in 2020, Wyoming was ranked nationally as 44th in youth access to mental health care. And at this point in 2022, we're now ranked at 36th. I'm not saying it's just this, I'm just saying like we're making, I feel like we're making a move in the needle in some positive direction. So I am excited about that. So Mr. Chairman, I also want to say that we've been doing a lot of partnering with the Department of Health. We've seen a lot more coordination between what they are able to do and things that they're able to offer to school districts, and partnering with the Department of Ed, partly because we have staff, right? Like these grants have all added an additional person inside the Department of Ed for the three big federal grants that we have. And so we at least have 3 more people that are able to work closely with the Department of Health and providing services and making sure that they have access inside the schools in ways I don't know that they necessarily had before, and we continue to build on that. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to take questions. And
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and thank you, Laurel, for doing that. And thanks for helping kids. So a couple questions. One is, how much of what you're currently do, this 29,000 kids that have access, how much of that is related to basically some federal ARPA dollars, CARES Act dollars, in other words, dollars that are soon to go away? So of what you're serving, how much is soon to go away in 2024, 2025, as you mentioned there? And then second, have you built that out in your, I guess you've got grants, you've got applicants, you've provided services, but if you built that out for all districts, all kids, have you done some of that work to look at what that cost might be? I mean, you could just say, well, we know we've got this much money and we've got this much service, we can throw those numbers out there, but I wonder if you've actually put some work into building that out. And that's a very similar, I mean, in Sublette, I know they use a very similar model, ARPA dollars, the same sort of thing, telehealth with and some local government dollars as well, so.
I think, Mr. Chairman, I'm waiting. All right, so how long it'll last, all of this is federal funds. So they're all 100% grant funds, either through SAMHSA or Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration, I think. There you go. Thank you. I always have to look it up. But so it either is coming from them or it is coming through the federal stimulus funds, or right, like we're through the ARPA or ESSER, yep. So like the work that we're doing with the districts in the Big Horn Basin, that money will run out at the end of this year. So I mean, there's definitely some of those. I do know that we have a model, and I will have to go back and get numbers for you as to how much this is costing. We do pay the providers the Medicaid reimbursable rate, so that's what when they agree to be a part of this, that's what part of what they're agreeing to. And we've been trying to figure out how to make this sustainable. So right, like we give them some upfront and kind of like figure out how, so that we could start it, and then we want it to continue when the federal dollars are done. And what we're finding is that the current Medicaid rate is just not enough to be able to sustain this with the costs. I can go back and look at exactly what it is, but I wanted to say that my staff estimated it at about 115, but I'd have to go back and verify that for sure.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I think, Laurel, if you could come up with some of that, so we have and I'm sure you're going to have to do this anyway for the Education Committee as well. So I think there's going to be plenty of conversation around this. And I just think this is one of the really important issues. I don't know what has happened and why we have such a need for mental health services now in schools, but we do. And we just can't ignore it. I don't know how we're going to solve it. You know, I think there's little solutions out there that I think what you've done and other districts are doing. And, you know, if we can just keep the patchwork together, you know, I think local community-based solutions are better than just a statewide thumb on it. But we have to be able to maintain that community-based service. And how we do that, I think, is the question that, you know, you need to think about, and we need to think about, and all of us need to think about.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Laurel, that is incredible. And I don't know if I had any idea the scale of what you guys are doing in terms of mental health services for students. My question is in any of those grants or any of those districts, is there a component that works with families as well as that idea about children certainly come to school with issues, but they also go home and probably carry those with them, or they start at home? So has there been any discussion through that grant work, you know, in an educational setting about incorporating family or bringing family into those services as well? Or is it just pretty narrow?
Families are actually included in part of this, right? So if there is a need to bring the family in, that is incorporated into all of this as well. We built that in as we created this, so that if you need family services and those kinds of things, then that's available to you. The other thing I think I forgot to talk about is that we're working on the contract right now. We did an RFP to look at somebody to do some care management, right? Like the case, sorry, like, right, like to be able to, words are losing me, but we're working on a contract at this point with Care Solace to be able to create, have an avenue to match cares, to match the needs of students, families, staff, anybody that is connected to them, to the kids in that way. So anybody in their household, anybody in the families in the school district, families in the community that have students that are connected to school, it'll help provide them and match them with providers that will be able to meet whatever their needs are. So we're hoping to have that rolled. We were hoping to have it this month. That didn't happen. So we're looking at rolling that out in August when school starts as well, which will be another piece of connecting to it. It'll be different than this, right? Like it pays for basically the connector, right, between the mental health providers and the individuals that'll be that are in need of services. But at least it gives them some avenues to connect them to those folks. That is being paid out of our ARPA funds, Mr. Chairman, so.
Senator Morrow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'll just speak to the kid clinic in Gillette, which is what Campbell County's 8,400 students or something like that. So that's a pretty big part of that. And sustainability is, I'm on the advisory board. Sustainability, long-term sustainability is the biggest thing. Built a clinic, I think finished that clinic maybe 2 years ago. Sorry, a new clinic, brand new clinic in the community. We're literally starting on a second clinic now. That's how the demand is. And this is both medical services and mental health services. So it's a full service clinic. The other thing unique in going to the family thing about the Campbell County, I don't know if it's unique, I should say, this is just what I understand is occurring is any child in the family is eligible. They don't have to be school-age children. So you walk in with your 7-year-old who's in first or second grade, whichever that is, 7 years old, and you've got your 3-month-old or your 4-year-old there, and they can get all of their health care there. Not the adults per se, but they get referred on. So anyway, so there are, I think, but sustainability is a big deal, is the big deal for this type of effort. And that's what I think the group in my community is, and it's the hospital, which is the community mental health provider in my community, and the school districts, and this is so important. We got to make this, try to make this work. So anyway, I guess my curiosity is how do we get to the sustainability issue and get past the pilot project issue? And I'm not discounting pilot projects, and I'm not trying to say but how do we actually get it to, no, this is what we really should do? Because I'm thrilled for the 29,000 plus. I'm concerned about the other 60,000, because that's kind of the balance if we're at 80 or 90-some thousand kids in public schools, right, K-12. How do we help that? So, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So anyway, don't you think, Mr. Chairman?
Me and Representative Summers agree, right? Questions? Representative Summers, please.
You know, Mr. Chairman, I think some of the things that we can go forth to look for that sustainability, and we just ask ourselves internally, one is, you know, obviously, as you look at, and you and I had this discussion, Mr. Chairman, about the funding model for education, whether you add something to that or not add something to that. I mean, we are not, and if you do you do it outside the model where you can't put it in the block grant? You kind of force it to be spent for what it's supposed to be spent for. There's some of those things you can do. You know, what I tried to do when I was on ed last year was create a little grant program that really required some match from local districts to kind of incentivize these partnerships we're talking about. And then I think, you know, the question for our state agencies is what out there is, what federal is there, right? And is there a way you can have communications with your federal partners to go this, and they all know it, right? This is a big deal right now. So are we going to see some sustained federal dollars towards children's mental health services? And if we are, what may that look like, and how can we bridge maybe till we get to that? Or, because I'm assuming there's a lot of people thinking about this. So I think we just have to look at these different avenues. And once again, I want to go back to, it'd be great if the state could just pay for it all, but we can't. We're not going to. I'm not sure that's the best program for the communities, even though it's easy. I think if we can help communities be successful with their efforts, I think it's still better because it's homegrown and I think appreciated and accepted better within those communities. So that's my question to Director Schmidt and Director Johansson.
Director Johansson.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, in relation to that, Laurel, and I might have missed it, in the mental health services and this access that's rolling out, just roughly, do you know how much of that direct service is being provided on the campus of the school, or is it really more referral engines to, you know, services outside of the walls of the school?
Please.
Mr. Chairman, for the grants that we have, almost all of them are provided on site. We do have some, right, like that where they transport them, right, to a provider inside the school, just, you know, like Fremont One does this, right? I think to some extent where some of the students go and receive the services at the provider in the community, and then they bus them, you know, bring them back. But I'm pretty sure the rest of them are all set up within their school.
And Mr. Chairman, the reason I bring that up directly related to Speaker Summers' question is when we talk about sustainability, you know, a couple of years ago, the legislature passed our Medicaid school-based services, and we've worked with the Department of Ed and have onboarded 5 districts into being able to bill Medicaid for services on site. And I think that can include mental health, PT, OT, those types of things. We only have one billing. I believe that's Converse County. But I know there's some that want us completely withdrawing from federal funding in Medicaid, but that is absolutely an avenue when we talk about school-based services where you can essentially grow the pie or at least reduce the exposure. And it's not everything, but it's something that can stretch, whether that's local dollars or state dollars, if we can match them one-to-one with Medicaid funds. That's an opportunity for the districts, for their Medicaid, you know, their young Medicaid population to be able to, again, grow the pie. So we'll be looking, I think we have 2 more districts in the pipeline that are starting to onboard, and hopefully 4 out of those 5 that I mentioned that aren't billing will begin to. It's bureaucratic. It's not the easiest thing for entities in the world to become Medicaid billers. But I think we've set up a process that makes it as easy as possible. So just one suggestion for the communities that are really engaging in that type of school-based service on the side of the school, there's ways to grow that through federal matches.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Speaker Summers, in regard to Department of Family Services funding, a few years ago, the federal government recognized that in terms of child welfare, that they needed to be doing more to support children and families before they have to come into care. So the Family First Act then opened up a funding source that we can access. That's a 50-50 match similar to Medicaid. The issue that we have is that the available programs have to be listed as an evidence-based program on a clearinghouse. So the idea is that children who are candidates for foster care, children who are at risk of coming into care, we can use dollars to support them in various ways as long as they're using one of the prescribed programs. What has been difficult about that is sometimes these prescribed programs don't have the economy of scale that we need because they're evidence-based. It usually takes quite a few kids to create the financial ability to support it. Partnering with the schools, however, where they have access to a few more kids may make that a little bit more feasible. And so there is some opportunity that would be a very localized conversation. But if there's already communities that have started down this route and are maybe looking at some of these mental health services, we could be working with them on a very prescribed model that's really family-based, and there's specific things. So it's limited because we can't do everything. It has to be for a certain group and it has to be a certain kind of service, but it is opening up the door a little bit to mental health services for school-age children.
Director Schmidt, did you say that was a similar to Medicaid on the 50-50 match, or okay, I didn't understand that. Representative Summers, please.
Then, Mr. Chairman, you know, the other conversation you and I've had for, over a year really on this is, our local mental health centers, right? And what is their role? What is their capacity, once again, right, to handle this? And because I think based upon, the work you did, it's a priority population. I think that's what you've told me, that children are a priority population for our community mental health centers. So the question is, why isn't that filling the need as well as it should be? So I hope when we get the community health center folks up to the mic, we can have a discussion about what's necessary for them to help fill this void, fill this need, as well as how we can get other resources into it. So.
Mr. Chairman, and Corinne, I just want to let you know too, that like with the work that we've been doing with the grants, all of that has that evidence-based practice requirement in there too. So there may be interesting conversations to be had clearly on how these align. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I think before we go to public comment, I think we've seen evidence that there's some great work being done, Department of Education. Thank you for doing that. It's just to Senator Barlow's, the sustainability and how does that look like and how are we going to recommend that? And there is a tie into the work that's being done with the community mental health centers, but I think that really is, Howard. Yes, Albert, please.
Mr. Chairman, too, as we think about this, right, we're talking about a student that's basically at crisis or near a crisis, right? We're talking tier 3 on a lot of what we're talking about now is the tier 3 and not the tier 1. And I think as we heard as we all know by now, as we talk about mental health service, the further upstream you get, the more headway you're going to make on the issue. And, and I'm not going to run that bill, but, I think we have to have a discussion about children and social media. and what that has done for bullying and a variety of other things in our schools. And how to, is that a cat that's just out of the bag, or is it a cat that, or did we let it out of the bag and we got to put it back in a bag? And, I just think there's some things that we need to understand. We need to understand what's behind all of this. And some of it is the old classics, right? The family that's a broken family, then, or a family that's got substance abuse, or you got poverty. We have all of those old things that feed this. But what else is there out there that we can do? And I think this is something for Department of Education, on our bullying stuff, right? And what are you guys doing recently to address social media bullying, and how do we get a handle on that? I know what, the bill is, you run a bill, just like alcohol, you can't have a social media account until you're 18 years old. I don't think that'd be very popular. But I mean, at some point when a drug becomes, in society, when a drug becomes out of control and we decide it has to be limited, we look at that. And so is there other ways we can work on the bullying issue that we haven't done?
Or somebody who maybe ask our staff, I know Utah passed a social media bill, and maybe you reference that.
I've heard there's two states, but I don't know exactly what they did.
Maybe see if we can get that done. There's a clip with that.
I think that's what I heard, that's right.
Okay, let's go to public comment. Hang in there.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My apologies, but you have all my favorite topics.
Yep.
You're in one place on one day. So thank you for your patience. So from a community mental health center perspective, I want to show some data that we've gotten from our national partners. Now, this is national data. I always get frustrated with Wyoming because we don't necessarily have enough numbers and statistically significant and all that fun stuff to have our own data. But in 2021, 42% of K-12 students reported they felt persistently sad or hopeless. Nearly 1/3, about 29%, said they experienced poor mental health. Nearly 1 in 5, 22% of students seriously considered attempting suicide, and nationally it's 1 in 10 did attempt suicide. So that's 10% of K-12. So Wyoming is not alone in any of this. This is a national problem. Certainly the pandemic has exacerbated that. We saw an increased risk, or not increased risk, but increased demand in services, in reports, coming from schools about concerns in the pandemic, and that has not appeared to wane all of that much. So I won't sit here and try to have a conversation about why that is. There's a lot of different opinions and a lot of different factors. I think the question is, how do we address that going forward in Wyoming to really get the support that our schools and our K-12 students need? A couple of points that I think we haven't talked about yet, but I think are important to the conversation. The idea of universal screening in K-12 could potentially be a very helpful tool. It's not something that we're necessarily doing right now, but I think it might be worthy of a discussion. Again, the further upstream you can catch folks, the better off they usually are. So I think that is worthy of conversation. I'm going to call out the job that the teachers and the school counselors and the school psychologists and the administrators all do at being essentially their crisis interventional specialists at the school. And I think that we can work with them better to provide more training and more support, not trying to put anything more on their plate, but it appears that they're already dealing with this conversation, and want to have that conversation with them and find out what tools would be helpful. I think it's important in Wyoming to maximize our resources across the spectrum. So you have school counselors, you have school psychologists, they have completely different scopes of practice than a licensed professional counselor or a licensed clinical social worker or a psychologist. They have some overlap. I know the Wyoming Education Association can't be here today, but they have this very cool Venn diagram that I have permission to email all of you guys that talks about, they all do a little bit different things. There is some overlap. So I think the conversation becomes about how we maximize those resources. When a concern is identified or a need is identified in K-12 schools, how are we referring that out? I think right now we have some great programs that are going on with both private providers and community mental health centers and up at WBI that are all contributing to providing that care. How do we make sure that in two or 3 years, when that funding might not be there, how do we construct that referral system? For the community mental health system, how do we construct that referral for that description that I read you guys earlier? Those kids are a priority one, tier 1 population. That's really important, especially for the families that don't have resources. So if there's not a grant funding to pay for that care, then community mental health centers might be the best option for them and their families to come in and get services and treatment. How do we work with the K-12 schools to provide that in the most effective manner possible? So I will share, as a parent, picking kids up, taking them to doctor's appointments, transitioning them back, it's a lot of work. It takes a lot of time. And so is there a conversation to be had about how we can work directly, locally in our communities to make that happen? I think there is, and I think it's probably a local conversation with each school district. I think all of those things that I've listed, and I know I've given you a laundry list, are really important factors in the K-12 discussion, along with even going back to what are we doing in our preschools, at our 3 to 5 year age? Are we providing universal assessments? Are we trying to engage families that are in those settings as well? That's incredibly important, again, catching them as early as possible. So I think it's a lot of small bites right now at the apple, with a big focus on trying to make sure that the sustainability is there in a couple of years to at least keep together the services that we have and maybe even expand that to the other school districts. There's been a lot of discussion about bringing mental health professionals and hiring them in the schools. In fact, the community mental health centers, they don't really have any opposition to that, other than we have no idea where we're going to find them in Wyoming. We just don't have that workforce. So I think that goes back to a conversation about how do we maximize the resources that we do have. So if we have crisis intervention at K-12 and they notice a problem, how do we make it as easy as possible for them to get those kids over to services and into the appropriate level services? I think we're trying that out with these grant programs to a certain extent, and maybe learning some lessons and figuring out how to do that better long-term. But I don't know that hiring mental health professionals in all of the school districts is possible in Wyoming. We just don't have the workforce for that. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to stop there and just say, with behavioral health redesign, this is also on our plate. This is an important topic and a conversation that the community mental health centers have been having about how to move in that direction and provide that support to our K-12 schools when it goes into effect on July 1, beyond what we're already doing now. So we'll continue those conversations. Stand for any questions.
Director Johansson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Andy, is universal screening exactly like it sounds? You provide a mental health screening for everybody?
Mr. Chairman, Director Johansson, in some cases, in the examples I have seen that, yes. In some, it is more of a triage filter that is used by parents or school counselors. So I've seen both models.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, if I can, I'm not I just don't know what that is. So a universal mental health screening means at some level you use a tool for anybody that comes in the office versus models where you screen every student.
Mr. Chairman, Director Johansson, so yes, that is one particular model where you use an assessment tool when somebody comes into an office, and it can be used by a school counselor or administrator or something along those lines. Another model that we have seen is they just make it part of welcome back to school. Everybody does that assessment.
Here's your mental health test.
Yeah. So I think it's a good conversation to have, what might be practical in that vein and what might be helpful. And screening everybody might not be helpful, but maybe putting it in some targeted hands might be.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other public comment? Simone. Just graduated from Leadership Wyoming. Way to go.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm just here to highlight some things that may have been overlooked or also expand on some things.
Please provide us with your name and who you represent.
Thank you, sir. Lindsay Simino with the Wyoming Counseling Association. Forgive me. As far as what a mental health screening could look like, as this committee has talked about today, as far as local solutions for local problems, that can be as simple or as complex as that district would like to deem appropriate. As far as very common brief mental health screenings that are offered, that providers offer throughout the state, regardless of setting, the PQ9, 9 questions about anxiety. They offer an adult, they offer a child screener. The Vanderbilt is used for ADHD screening, but it also provides questions within it that is anxiety as well as oppositional defiant disorder based. These are 1 to 2 pagers. Many times parents are filling these out when they go to the doctor. They're very quick. So if, as the different department chairs discuss what this is going to look like and are wanting to add something that is brief as well as evidence-based, I think that you would find that there is something comparable that would serve that purpose, but not overwhelm parents or overwhelm the agencies that are involved. I also wanted to highlight for Representative Summers that 2 states that passed the social media bills this session were Arkansas and Utah. And what they did was require social media to require age verification when creating a new account. That age verification would be 18 and over. Any social media that was allowing for a new account to be created for somebody that is under 18 would be charged different fines. The fines varied based on state. So I wanted to provide the committee with that information as well. As this committee considers different solutions to these problems, we are grateful for these conversations to exist. We do agree that this is going to take local solutions. We would like to encourage whatever those solutions are, that data collection is part of that. We love to show the legislature and the different departments what they are getting for whatever funding is spent, whether those are federal or state dollars. That gets a little tricky on a local level if everybody is doing something slightly different. I also know that me suggesting that on a Friday is easier said than done, but would like to highlight that nonetheless. And with that, I stand for question.
Questions? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any other public comment? Seeing none, none on the line. So committee, here's where I think I'd like to do. I talked to Chairman Baldwin a little bit, is if you would be, for you agency people and court people, it's obvious that there's some overlapping on these topics. And so you're going to be using your resources within your agencies to kind of help provide information and give insight in that. For our legislators, Chairman Zwanich and Senator Barlow and Mr. Speaker and myself, and if you guys could email me the 2 topics that you're most interested in, because I'm thinking that I'd like to see us be able to do some work in between our meetings to ferret out some of this stuff and give us a little more. We've got a lot of ground to plow before the end of the year and to make recommendations back. So, and if you have concerns about that approach, then put that in your email to me, tell me how dumb I am, and I'll be okay with that as well. So, but if you would do that, and then we won't go into a lot of detail. 2 of the 4. Which 2 of the 4? We'll be participating in all, but I'm going to I think we're going to give some homework assignments on the two that you're interested in. That makes sense. Okay. Thank you. With that, oh, I'm sorry, Senator Barlow.
Mr. Chairman, so some of this is work to be, or information and work still to be done. We had, I think, 4 draft or 4 bills that came before us. So is that a preliminary step? We want to actually have a couple of people take a look at those bills from DFS, I mean, a couple of folks and just say, okay, let's have some bill drafts ready for the next time, flesh them out a little bit, small working group or something, and have them ready, and then we can decide if we want to move them forward or recommend them or make the adjustments. I mean, I'm just, you want to get some work done? Let's
So
get
in
some
my
work done.
mind, those 4 bills are attached to the vulnerable adults. And so if that's where your interest is, that's where I was going to put those bills. And yes, we do want to flesh those out and see if we can start either putting a stamp of approval as is, or suggesting some amended language to it. They're purely in draft form, and we can do whatever we want. But yes, we want to be moving forward with that. Go ahead, please.
So Mr. Chairman, I don't know, maybe you're asking for volunteers. I'll volunteer to take up those bills with the help of Director Schmidt and maybe the courts to make sure we have definitions right and examine some of that. We asked for some other folks to give us some definitional.
Would you mind
I'll email
including
you. Yep.
Senator Nethercott on that? Because that was her vulnerable adult bill, and so she might have some familiarity. And then on I forget, which was the other bill that we talked about? There's one other bill that she's actually in court on today on, but you might include her as well.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
that's the civil cause of action. Bill.
Okay. Thank you. Anything else? Anything else for the good of the world? Thanks. Yes.
So what is the timeline for next meetings, and what do you anticipate through this
So-
interim, so I can kind of anticipate?
So our next meeting is in July, is that right, Katie? And that's going to be here? That's in Lander? Yeah, we've had some changes, trying to get, so July will be in Lander, and we'll be getting, it is convenient for some of us greedy old guys.
So, Mr. Chairman, to that point, so that's 2 months, basically, 2 months from now. Well, and then are you considering a third and a fourth meeting, or third meeting and then
the
start
next
making
meeting's
referrals?
Next meeting's in August here, and then a 4th meeting, right? Yeah, here, in October.
So my question is, if we're going to start making recommendations to appropriations, obviously that can go later on. But if we're going to start making recommendations to labor health or to judiciary or something, it matters when their second and third meetings are, so that we can get them up to speed. So anyway, I just want to understand the process of where we are.
No, and I appreciate that, but with, this will allow us to coordinate kind of when their last meetings is. We know when Labor and Health's last meeting is now, but you're absolutely right. We've got to have it to them enough ahead of time that they can make some decisions as well, so.
Mr. Chairman, final inquiry on this is, if all else fails, we have management council to go to provide us sponsorship of bills or appropriations, because they'll meet very last.
Right.
So, okay, thank you.
Thank you. Please.
Mr. Chairman and Director Schmidt, so Director Schmidt, on the issue of money for vulnerable adults, what are we spending now in that grant process? And I think we have the statutory construct to do the money piece, and we can do it in the budget, but we kind of got to know what we're spending on what now and what we want to do, so. Okay, thanks.
So I'd really, anything else before I give would just like to thank agencies. This is a lot of stuff to put together, and provide for us today. You know, I hope, holy moly, right? Just a lot of foundational stuff. Thank you to those who were here today and provided insight to this. Hopefully you can see that it's the state's role, it's policy, it's funding, it's sustainability, all simple things, something we can take care of in a brief conversation this afternoon. And it is really, in my opinion, important, and appreciate the work that our courts have done, because that's been the missing component in a lot of this conversation. And we get down the road and we make these decisions, and they look at us and say, why'd you do that? It's because we don't live in that world. And so having these guys at the table has really been helpful, and look forward to their insights. So with that, that's the last time I'm going to say. Mr. Chairman, any closing comments? Drive safely on your way home, please, and thank you for all you've done.